Saat pengurusi Lembaga Pengarah Yayasan Warisan Melayu serta anggota Lembaga Pengarah MHF yang lain, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim, Puan Rahayu Buang. Penceramah kita hari ini, Encik Zainul Abidin Rasheed. Para pemimpin masyarakat kita dan Dedif terhormat, Pesuruhjaya Tinggi Malaysia ke Singapura, Datuk Dr. Azfar Muhammad Mustafa, betul? Dan para hadirin sekalian yang amat kami hormati, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera dan selamat datang ke Taman Warisan Melayu. Selamat datang juga kepada para peserta yang mengikuti acara ini secara langsung melalui laman Facebook kami. Memandangkan esok kita di Singapura akan mula berpuasa, sudah tentu semuanya sedang sibuk membuat persiapan untuk menyambut ketibaan bulan Ramadan. Walaupun demikian, anda semua telah sudi meluangkan masa pada petang ini untuk bersama-sama kami menjayakan siri ceramah Cendekiawan Lestari atau singkatannya CLS. Bagi pihak Yayasan Warisan Melayu atau MHF, saya Julina, pengurus besarnya, mengucapkan terima kasih yang tidak terhingga atas sambutan dan sokongan anda semua. Siri ceramah Cendekiawan Lestari adalah antara program utama yang ditawarkan MHF sepanjang tahun. Siri ini telah dilancarkan pada Oktober 2020. Sepanjang 2020 hingga 2021, 6 sesi telah dianjurkan memaparkan golongan cendekiawan dan ilmuwan masyarakat kita dari pelbagai bidang, sosiologi, pendidikan, keagamaan dan juga pembangunan masyarakat. Antaranya mereka ada hadir pada hari ini seperti Profesor Said Farid Alatas, Dr. Nur Aisyah Abdul Rahman, penyampai-penyampai lain termasuk Profesor Madya Dr. Hadijah Rahmat, Haji Ma'ruf Sahleh dan juga Dr. Muhammad Aidil Subhan. Alhamdulillah. Oh, Dr. Yaakob also dah mention tadi. Okay. Bukan amnesia. Okay, Dr. Yaakob adalah pembuka tirai pada musim pertama dahulu, ya. Okay, alhamdulillah, maklum balas yang kami terima rata-rata positif dan amat menggalakkan. InsyaAllah dengan sokongan anda, kami berharap dapat terus menganjurkannya pada tahun-tahun mendatang. Tahun ini kami amat bertuah kerana telah mendapat sokongan daripada Majlis Ugama Islam Singapura dan mantan anggota parlimen kita Encik Rohan Khamis untuk memulakan musim kedua kali ini. Peluang untuk anda juga memberi sokongan untuk program ini masih ada. Kod QR-nya telah kami kongsikan awal tadi dan akan dikongsikan lagi di akhir majlis nanti. Okay. 6 lagi penceramah telah kami undang untuk musim kedua ini. Kami rasa amat teruja dan besar hati kerana kali ini Encik Zainul Abidin Rasheed telah sudi menerima lamaran kami menjadi pembuka bicara bagi musim kedua kali ini. So tanpa berlengah, saya ingin menjemput Dr. Nosyari Saad, pengurusi Lembaga Pengarah Yayasan Warisan Melayu untuk memberikan sepatah dua kata dan memperkenalkan pembicara kita pada hari ini. Dipersilakan, Doktor.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat datang semua ke Taman Warisan Melayu. Ini adalah sesi pertama bagi siri kedua Cendekiawan Lestari sini, CLS, anjuran Yayasan Warisan Melayu. Sedang hadirin tokoh-tokoh masyarakat yang saya hormati, di Singapura ini banyak sekali kegiatan-kegiatan yang dianjurkan untuk meraihkan budaya dan warisan Melayu. Misalnya baru-baru ini MHC ataupun Taman Warisan Melayu baru sahaja melancarkan buku Senusantara, hasil kerjasama MHC dengan komuniti-komuniti etnik Melayu di Singapura seperti masyarakat Bawean, Banjar, Bugis, Minang dan Jawa. Setiap tahun, MHC juga menganjurkan Pesta Budaya Melayu Singapura ataupun Malay Culture Fest. Acara-acara ini tidak akan berhasil tanpa sokongan anda. Kita juga ada banyak acara-acara budaya yang dianjurkan oleh badan-badan setempat, pesta-pesta budaya, tarian, persembahan muzik dan sebagainya. Kami di Yayasan Warisan Melayu mengucapkan syabas kepada semua penggiat seni, pencinta warisan dan budaya di luar sana dan kami akan sentiasa menyokong usaha-usaha ini. Sidang hadirin sekalian, walau bagaimanapun, kita di Yayasan Warisan Melayu rasa masih ada kekurangan dalam usaha melestarikan budaya kritikal dan ilmiah. Status kegemilangan masyarakat bukan sekadar menyatakan bahawa kita sudah maju. Kita perlu terus peka membincangkan masalah-masalah yang membelenggu masyarakat. Saya pernah mewawancara seorang agamawan atau kiai semasa melakukan kajian lapangan di Indonesia satu masa dahulu. Ketika itu saya masih seorang penuntut. Saya terpanggil untuk berkongsi pengalaman saya ini. Nasihat agamawan ini kepada saya adalah untuk menjana kemajuan masyarakat, kita tidak perlu tertakluk hanya pada satu cara berfikir, tetapi berani mengedepankan idea-idea alternatif. Kemudian sama-sama kita nilai yang terbaik buat kemajuan masyarakat kita. Kalau kita tidak berwacana atau kita menyekat pandangan-pandangan yang berbeza, atau kita tidak menilai sesuatu pandangan berdasarkan kesannya, masyarakat kita akan mundur. Dalam menganjurkan siri ini, Yayasan Warisan Melayu ingin mengajak masyarakat Melayu Islam Singapura berfikir bersama. Selain itu, kita juga mahu meraihkan ilmuwan setempat. Ada tokoh politik, ada tokoh sastra, tokoh bahasa, mereka yang mungkin mendalami sosiologi agama, pakar undang-undang. Kita beri mereka ruang, kemudian kita dokumentasikan pandangan-pandangan mereka. Bayangkan, sampai sekarang ini kita masih punya kebolehan untuk membincangkan secara ilmiah tulisan-tulisan seperti Abdullah Abdul Kadir Munshi tentang feudalisme, puisi Tuan Simi tentang eksploitasi kapitalisme, Syed Sheikh Al-Hadi tentang reformisme agama dan gender, Ahmad Son Haji dan Syed Abdullah Al-Jufri dalam bidang tafsir, Syed Hussein Alatas dalam orientalisme, sosiologi korupsi dan kemajuan berfikir, Masuri SN, Muhammad Latif Muhammad, Muhammad Arif Ahmad dalam bidang sastra yang cenderung pada pengamatan sosial. Lihat sahaja usaha kita selama ini di MHF. Kita ada buku tulisan Pak Suratman Markasan. Ya, dan kita boleh nilai, kita boleh kaji dalam bidang sajak-sajak, puisi dan sastra dan sebagainya. Inilah kelebihan kita mendokumentasikan usaha-usaha mereka. Dan hasil dari CLS yang pertama ini, kita sudah punya tulisan Prof. Dr. Yaakob Ibrahim, Prof. Hadijah Rahmat, Prof. Syed Farid Alatas, Haji Ma'ruf Saleh, Dr. Aidil Subhan dan Dr. Nur Aisyah. Kita akan terus memperkaya warisan intelektual kita dan juga akan datang mempamerkan tulisan cendekiawan muda. Ini adalah harapan kami di Yayasan Warisan Melayu. Tentu sekali tidak semua kita akan bersetuju, namun itulah matlamatnya yang saya katakan tadi. Kalau kita hanya ada satu cara berfikir, kita tidak akan lihat blind spots. Teruslah menyokong usaha kami ini. Dan saya sekali lagi ingin mengucapkan terima kasih kepada Muiz dan Rohan dan Mah kerana menyokong CLS kali ini. Kami harapkan sokongan daripada badan-badan lain juga. Okay, that is my mukadimah. This is not my lecture. This is Mr. Zainul's lecture. So let me very quickly introduce our distinguished speaker for today. As someone who's born in the 1980s, so there's a bit of mix-up whether I'm a Gen X or I'm a millennial, but I'm inclined to think that I'm a millennial. I grew up learning about this man, Mr. Zainul Abidin Rasheed. In the 1990s, every Muslim household in Singapore would receive this magazine, if you recall. It's called Warita Kita. It's a Muiz publication sent by post into our mailboxes. And this was before the internet age. And through these magazines, we get to know about Mr. Zainul Abidin Rasheed, who happened to be the MUIS president. When I was in primary school, my family encouraged me to read Berita Harian, and I proudly say I still read Berita Harian to this very day. And it happens that Mr. Zainul was formerly the BH editor. He was also the Sunday Times editor at that point of time. But interestingly, when we read the newspapers during that period about Mr. Zainul Abidin Rasheed, there was always this speculation, is he going to run the next elections? A lot of times, we read, and it happened that he said yes, I think in 1997 elections. But already he was already a community leader, well known at that point of time. So, as he was also formerly CEO Mendaki, so he has done many things in the community. So as CEO Mendaki, MUIS president, Berita Harian editor, and later the founding member of Malay Heritage Foundation. So if today we have M Kuasa 3, we have Zainul Abidin Kuasa 3 at that point of time because he has contributed a lot. Maybe Kuasa 3, 4 atau 5 because he has basically touched or led those community institutions. But I got to know Mr. Zainul more closely in the later part of my life, to be exact in the last 6 years, where I had the privilege to work with Mr. Zainul on 2 publications. The first is Majulah, in commemoration of Singapore's 50-year celebration, where we reflect on the developments of the Malay Muslim community. And the second one, Beyond Bicentennial, this one together with Cikgu Wan Hussein Zuhri. Writing these publications was an enriching experience for me, and the process of authoring these books very, very meaningful. In every meeting, Mrs. Zainul would kindly bring us something to eat, thankfully, because we always had heated discussions and frank ones as well, and the topics were very heavy, but I really, really enjoyed those moments, especially learning from someone with vast experience in the community, in politics, and in foreign affairs. Despite his vast wealth of experience, Mr. Zainul remains a very humble man. You don't believe me, you ask Dr. Azhar and Madam Rahyu Buang, who's here. It took us 3 hari 3 malam, to actually persuade him. And maybe more, 7 hari 7 malam to persuade him to speak today. He always said that he's not an intellectual, he's not a Cendekiawan. But honestly, who calls himself a Cendekiawan? Professor Alatas did not call himself an intellectual. Edward Said, who wrote about intellectuals, never called himself one. They underline the traits, and I believe it's an aspiration that they want their people, the society to reach. It's a high standards that they want to set in society about who is a Cendekiawan, who are the thinkers in society. And I repeatedly said many times that Cendekiawan Lestari series is not about those with PhDs only, because a thinking man not necessarily have a PhD. Okay? So I think we must set this very clear. It's like being an ulama. Nobody out there calls himself an ulama. The scholars in the past, they never said, saya adalah seorang ulama. I think that's not the aspirations of the scholars of the past. And Mr. Zainul, in our conversations, always said that nobody is going to listen to his grandfather's stories. But I told him, grandfather stories are important for the young to understand the origins, the nature, as well as the functions of our society. Some of us need to mediate our utopian ideas and know where we begin. And I think by having this conversation, we can bring the community forward. Okay, I shall stop here again because this is not my lecture. Today is Mr. Zainul's platform, so without further ado, may I now invite Mr. Zainul Abidin Rasheed to deliver his Cendekiawan series lecture.
It's quite misty, just like the topic. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yang saya muliakan, Dr. Yaakob Ibrahim, my good friend, family friend, and also former minister in charge of Muslim Affairs. Dato' High Commissioner Dato' Azhar, Dr. Nur Sharil, Dr. Azhar, Julina, dan Rahayu. Then, in fact, I practically know all of you here, right? And that's why it makes me nervous. Tapi saya sungguh merasa bangga dapat berdiri di sini untuk satu pengongsian. Benar apa yang dikatakan oleh Dr. Nur Sharil, it takes a lot of persuasion for him to convince me. But this is one occasion I fail to convince him that I'm not the person for this. Seperti yang kita lihat dari lecture yang dimulakan dengan dan oleh Dr. Yaakob Ibrahim sendiri, Azhar, Dr. Aisyah, and a few others, who Dr. Khadijah, and then the rest. I could see dari segi mutu cendekiawannya itu penuh dengan research, penuh dengan references, dan ini yang saya kurang bukan tak minat tapi kurang disiplinnya itu untuk melakukannya. So jadi bila diminta juga, dan oleh kerana saya juga dulu menjadi pengurusi daripada Malay Heritage Foundation, Yayasan Warisan Melayu, jadi saya rasa berat juga untuk menolaknya. Jadi di sinilah saya sekarang ini, dan saya akan cuba seberapa yang boleh untuk memastikan bahawa pengongsian kita ini will be lebih daripada grandpa stories. I'm quite well known for my grandpa stories. So much so, even my own children say, "Apa, please lah, enough of your grandpa stories." Tapi I would like to emphasize here, this is beyond the grandpa stories. And in fact, although I said earlier on that even this topic is beyond me, but I add that it is beyond history, beyond the realities we face today, because we are talking about the future too, which is a very important area of concern, where we need to not only understand the young, the millennials, or even the younger ones, but how do we put to effect that understanding, or lack of understanding, as we forge programs and conversations and engagement for the sake of the future. I'm going to touch about history first. History, whether beyond Sang Nila Utama and after. The history of Singapore going through pre-independence, even Japanese occupation, our days in Malaysia, post-Malaysia. Ini I got to be careful sikit lah, yang berhormat this year. And also about what we represent today as in the context of the globalized Singapore, the world that is changing. If you see, for example, around us now, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, China, America, Europe, European Union, it's all in the news today. And they are actually posing challenges about the changes to come and what impact it will have in terms of how do we, Singapore, look at that future. So let me start off by saying, more than just history and more than just sharing my personal life journey, let's look to the future. Sorry, I need generation, silver generation. Jadi kadang-kadang not so familiar with this sort of thing. Yeah, that's well, that's our founding Prime Minister, and his book, I think, is a must-read for all of us, The Singapore Story. And beyond his writings about the Singapore story, there's a lot more that I think we need to also catch up with. Whether it's about understanding the colonial period, understanding about when we celebrate our bicentennial, 200 years since the coming of Raffles and the opening, rather than discovery, the opening of Singapore as a port. And then, as distinguished from our 50 years post-independence, about Malaysia. In fact, there's a book also called Rethinking Malaysia, about konfrontasi, Sukarno and China. These are some of the areas. Rising 50, meaning the relationship between Singapore and Indonesia. RI, Sing, Rising 50. So these are some of the books which I feel will add to our understanding of what we're talking about. So going back to the history again, so when Singapore decided to celebrate our 200 years, I'm glad that our Prime Minister also emphasized that Singapore history is more than just about 200 years. Going back to even Sang Nila Utama. When Sang Nila Utama first came to Temasek, but even before Temasek, the Srivijaya kingdom, the influences from India. I mean, if you just ask yourself, how is it that Bali can remain as Bali in the Indonesian context, the largest Muslim country in the world, but yet Bali is basically Hindu in that sense? Did Singapore had that? I don't want to say risk, I didn't want to say opportunity, but was it because it's under British? But even Indonesia was under Dutch, but it precedes the colonial era, where Bali remains what it is today. In Singapore context, when before Raffles, I think we know about the writings that Dr. Yaakob also has spoken about it, that Singapore was indeed a very bustling area, even before Raffles came, although the British tried to deny it, that saying that we were like a dead island. Then, 200 years of British rule, I think that brought about a lot of changes. Majority, Malays being the majority then, soon was overwhelmed by immigration. Why? Many writings have been done about how the British look at our indigenous natives, and how the Malays then were seen as not interested in worldly things, business, were only interested in afterlife. And so they had to bring the business-like, the driven people, like the immigrants from China and India. But even then, how did it end up that became 70% Chinese when population settled down? Could it have been actually 70% Indians? And would it have changed the color, sorry if I use the word, of Singapore? Even if not 70% Indians, but if they had restrained, for example, the coming of Chinese into Singapore, so much so that the Chinese became about 45 or 50%, and the Indians and the Malays became 50%, would it have changed again the color of our Singapore? Like in Malaysia, for example, Malays are majority for sure, but the majority not like the Chinese who are majority in Singapore, 70%. The Malays are even lower, and they have the non-Malays in Malaysia, which are also creeping up to 45%. So which, with ramifications in terms of today's context about one man, one vote, democracy, Ketuanan Melayu, and what have you. So these are the historical developments that actually could have actually affected the kind of profile, the kind of outlook, and the kind of challenges it posed for this region. Then came the era of we all looking for independence. We knew that the Barisan Socialists was very active then. The Chinese group in Singapore, very active, very driven, very forceful. But then came also the English-educated Chinese, people like Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his friends. And there was a clash. But Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was able to use, actually, the Barisan people to forge and go for independence, but not without challenges. And the British would not let Singapore be independent, partly because of their fear that if Barisan was that strong, what kind of Singapore you will be? If the Chinese dominated Singapore, what kind of Singapore would it be post-independence? Because the British certainly would have still have interest in Singapore, economic interest in Singapore. So you can imagine. And they were encouraging us to join Malaya rather, and together with Sabah and Sarawak later, to form Malaysia. But even that was short-lived. It's partly because of the politics of race, the politics of numbers. And although Mr. Lee Kuan Yew felt that, in fact, we were hoping that Malaysia would be the hinterland for Singapore. What has Singapore got? A small island, hardly any agriculture, no oil. How do we survive without the hinterland? So the strategy was be part of Malaysia and join in and benefit from the collaboration and the unity in Malaysia. But that was short-lived too. And there were a lot of fears, one of which was Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was pushing for Malaysian Malaysia, which Malaysia, or Malaya rather, were not ready for, partly because they felt that the Chinese and the non-Malays had been taking advantage of the economic opportunities and all the benefits under the British rule, and Malays lagging behind, so we had to catch up, we had to overcome the issue, and we need a different, and Malaysia needed a different kind of approach, and including Ketuanan Melayu, with its ramification, with its challenges, even till today. As we can see, race politics is very much a part of Malaysia. But Singapore had to leave. Some people say that Singapore was kicked out, but Singapore had to leave and find its own route. Lee Kuan Yew shed tears. Some doubted whether it's genuine tears or not. But the tears were real in the sense that we have lost the hinterland. How do we survive? Will we be able to attract enough investment? And we decided to go the Singapore way with industrialization, with simple manufacturing at first, and later on to middle technology and even higher technology. And in fact, we became like the hub for the industrial process in the whole region, again, with challenges. But now, Singapore is like a first world in the region, and in many ways, we also complement the development of the countries in the region. And of course, I mustn't forget to mention about confrontasi with Sukarno, feeling that this was a British ploy to form Malaysia, disagreed with it, and launched his confrontasi, and we had our problems then. But post-independence, Singapore, again with 70% Chinese, had its own challenges too, with Indonesia too, because Indonesia had about maybe 8%, 10% Chinese, but again, very much dominant in terms of the economic areas of contribution and of benefits. So that's the historical journey which we went through, I think, which again colored the kind of Singapore that we have. But what about Singapore by itself? 70% Chinese, 15% Malays, 8% Indians. Are we that united? Were we that united? Were we that harmoniously believe in what Singapore wants to achieve? I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had very principled ways in looking at multiracialism. Article 152 is one. And later on, the concept of GRC, the concept of public housing, quota in public housing, is all to make sure that, in fact, multiracial harmony will work. Now, I'm raising all this, the journey, the historical journey, and later on my personal life journey, is because we want to draw some inferences in terms of what we understand by culture, the heritage point of view, the economic process, the economic development, and the challenges as we forge ahead to be a global Singapore in the context of our region. So those were the kind of things we went through. So, for example, I have known of people saying that, although despite Mr. Lee's political beliefs about Article 152 and making sure that the Malays are not lagging behind, but after a while, there were Chinese who believe that it's a waste of time to persuade the Malays to go for education, to go for development, to be part of that team, push Singapore as an economic entity. It was so difficult because there's so much lagging behind. In fact, it's easier just to push the Chinese, make the Chinese deliver a successful Singapore, and then we just put aside maybe 10% of our revenue or income, and that will take care of the Malays. And the Malays will be grateful because we not left them behind, we take care of them. But I was one of those actually who revolted against that idea among our inner circles. That I said, no, that's not the way. We should have an integrated approach where the Malays must be contributing to the whole of Singapore. It's not that you get the economic pie and then just give us charity. That doesn't work. And in fact, I think this is the kind of thing that brings about the kind of mindset and mind share, which we want the Singapore Malays to be as part of the total Singapore. And that surely cannot be just about economics. It must also be about what do we understand by multiracialism? What do we understand by contributing towards the total Singapore context of a very successful first world, multiracial, multireligious country and a people? So that's the historical perspective. But let me just now quickly share with you about my own personal life story. When I was in primary 3, I went first to Malay school. Again, part of the policies. When I was going to primary school, the policy about Malay language, national language, the importance of Malay language in the context of Malaysia and the region. So my parents sent me to Malay school. But in September of my primary 3, policies changed. And then my parents, or I think the school, decided to send me to an English school, Jalan Daud School. And then I went on to English education. In fact, if this is some area, this is one area where even the Chinese are still very unhappy with the ruling PAP group, as though they felt that PAP, the English-educated PAP leaders, were not sympathetic to the Chinese concern for the fear of losing Mandarin or losing their culture and heritage too. If Singapore Chinese became too Singaporean, too westernized, too forward-looking in that sense. So I remember in primary 3, I was in charge of the UNICEF milk program. Every morning I will go to school and start mixing free milk and give it to the poor. And who among the poor? Most of them are our own people, the Malays particularly. Some of them don't even have breakfast before going to school. And I remember that clearly. So in my mind, the emphasis, the focus then was well-being. Economic well-being. And they need help, we need help to them as we can. And when I went on to Raffles, I remember also the emphasis on national language was still very clear. And Raffles, in fact, initiated a national-based National Language Month drive, where I got together all the Malay language associations, societies, from all the major schools in Singapore, and had this National Language Month, just among ourselves, not by the ministry, but by ourselves. And language, mind you, which we thought was a very important part of our culture and again our heritage. The danger of us losing is there. This was much earlier on. But today we realize that in fact, when we talk about bilingualism, not only the Chinese, but the Malays are also fearing that they will lose their mother tongue because more and more homes are English speaking and the children are also English speaking in that sense. So then I was still in Raffles, I remember, in 1964 when we had the Prophet Muhammad's birthday celebration. This was in 1964 when Singapore was still part of Malaysia and tensions were still very high then about Singapore-Malaysia relations, about race relations. And during the Prophet's birthday, racial riots broke up. I wasn't on the streets then. I was at home. And so I didn't feel the fire of it. But Singapore government, PAP, Lee Kuan Yew, was very strong, very tough on it. And in a few months, they managed to bring back sanity and stability. And in September, they said, we are ready to go back to school. So we did. And I remember that Friday, I went to school, and we left school early to go to the mosque. We normally, from RI, we go to Sultan Mosque. One of my friends live in Jalan Pisang, so we normally go and singgah kat sana. So, but as we left school, we didn't realize that curfew had been called. In fact, one of my friends went to pay their PUB bill at City Hall then, and then we were told, what are you kids doing here? Riots have broken out in Geylang, in different parts of Singapore. Go home. How did we go home? We saw the streets jam-packed with cars. I looked into the cars, most of them are Chinese. Malays don't have that many cars. Malays have to depend on public transport. And we were stuck at the bus stand in front of what used to be the USIS, Chinese Chamber of Commerce. And then suddenly an empty lorry came by, and then the driver signaled to us. At the bus stop, I think most of them are Malays. The lorry driver signaled to us, said, please come, we're going to Geylang. Anybody want tompang, can tompang. So I was a bit suspicious. I had a second look, the driver was Chinese. I had another look, but the attendant was a Malay. So I said 50-50. And about 20 of us climbed onto the lorry. We went, and the lorry went up to where Lavender Street MRT is today. For some reason, the lorry went dead. And the streets were all lined up by Chinese workers at the cottage industries, ironmongers and all that. And can you imagine in the mind of the Chinese youth then, when 20 Malays rose from the lorry to get down, to get alternative transport, but in their mind it must be that the Malays are there to attack them. And they disappeared in their cottage industries, and the next moment they came out with iron rods, bicycle chains, acid bugs. And I saw with my own eyes people being maimed, being killed. Both Malays and Indians. They couldn't distinguish them between Malays and Indians. But I managed to grab a taxi moving with the doors open, managed to climb onto the taxi, grab the door, open the door and climb in, and managed to go to Kampung Supu, and there were riot squads there, and we managed to reach safely to Geylang Serai. But I didn't dare go by my front door because it was Juchat. It's a Malay, Chinese area. I only had to go back by the back door because it's Geylang Serai Malay area. That was the thing that colored my mind. I said, I think we must never allow racial riots to repeat in Singapore. So from racial riots, then we went on to university, determined to say, all the more we must make sure that we do our education well, succeed. Then I was in Singapore University, economics. I did economics and Malay studies, and I was very determined to make sure that there are enough Malays represented in the union, Students' Union, and Economic Society. But the Malay Language Society and the Muslim Society, University of Singapore, was pestering me, said, please lead this organization. We don't have leaders. I said, no, I want to remain in Economic Society and USU, University of Singapore Students' Union. And that was part of the problem. There was no integration. There was no intermingling. There's no contributing each other. So then I said, okay, I'll become vice president. You take over the chairmanship of the Malay Language Society and the Muslim Society. So I can see contributing in both. To me, in my mind, that's the way forward for all us Malays and non-Malays to work together. And I remember also when it comes to regional activities, we started to form regional cooperation between Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Anwar Ibrahim was in Malaysia, Nakholis Majid was in Jakarta, and the president of Islamic Society in Singapore persuaded me to go and represent Singapore in Jakarta. And I did, I went. So we formed PERMIAT, Persatuan Mahasiswa Islam Asia Tenggara. But before long, PERMIAT had to die a natural death. It just disappeared. Why? Because we couldn't agree. What kind of Muslim organization you want to be? Anwar Ibrahim, with his Islamization program in Malaysia, quite secular before, in the context of race politics, was trying to forge a different kind of Islamization. Indonesia had clearly decided on Pancasila, and they had a different route to take. And in Singapore, we were caught in between. And it just died a natural death. PERMIAT was lost like that. And that forced me, or persuaded me, to go around the world to study Muslim models, Muslim minorities all over the world. What kind of Muslim do you want to be? What kind of Muslims do the Malays in Singapore want to be in the context of the new Singapore? So I went to Europe, and you look at Turkish minorities living in their own enclaves. We go to France and see the Algerians, the Tunisian Arabs living in their own areas again, hardly mixing, hardly integrating. And then I went to America. Let me share with this anecdote. When I went to America, I remember it was Hari Haji, and I wanted so much to do the Salat Hari Haji, Eid al-Adha, and I didn't know where to go. So I just stuck my mind. I said, look up telephone directory. And what name other than Muhammad? So I called up, I saw the long list of Muhammad, and I called 3 names. The first name said, yeah, my father is a Muslim, a lady. Said, my father is a Muslim, but I'm no longer Muslim. I hope you will bear with me the details, because this kind of reflects the kind of society that's in. The second one said, oh, yeah, I'm a Muslim, but I'm not going because the mosque is so far away. Hours to go to the mosque. So I said, I understand, thank you. I was third time lucky. This Muhammad said, of course, brother, I will come and pick you up tomorrow morning, So he came tomorrow morning and picked me up. And really, he went nearly more than 1.5 hours. I was getting worried, was he going to hijack me or kidnap me? Then finally, we came to an open ground. I saw about 300 Muslims, ladies, children, and adults. I said, where? I thought you were going to take me to the mosque. He said, what mosque? Mosque is very far away. Where is this? You guess, he said. I said, no, I can't guess. It's a lawn. This was actually NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Agency. So there were a lot of Muslims. And NASA of America had attracted some of the best minds, best brains from the Muslim world, which I think in those days the Muslim countries couldn't bother with those kind of research, with those kind of interests, knowledge, and all that. The governments were either autocratic or feudalistic. That's the kind of society we had then, or political in Asia. So these people migrated and formed a core of NASA, which went into space studies. So I came back and I thought maybe one of the best places Muslims would have even migrate is America. But that was before Trump. Not only Trump, but I think you can see now all over the world, whether Islamophobia or even racism, how they look at Muslims, how they look at Malays. Will our Malays, the better educated Malays, be able to go and get the opportunities overseas? Will they be seen like generally Malays? So again, the lesson that came out of all this is that basically we have to look for our own model. There's no one size fits all. And like today's contact, we say it must be contextualization. And this is what Singapore is forging for too now. Then I was also invited by President Gaddafi then. In fact, Mr. Anwar Ibrahim was there too. Ridwan Saidi from Jakarta was there too. Gaddafi was a hero then. This is again to reflect the kind of mindset our leaders had, young leaders had then. Gaddafi invited us at the International Youth Conference, and basically to tell us, forget about the West, they don't trust you, you cannot work with them. Just we Muslims must get together and work together, fight the West, and go forward ourselves. And I was very happy, very fortunate that in fact the whole conference rejected Gaddafi's idea and said no. We want a more integrated, a more harmonious way, and let's work with the non-Muslims too. So those are the kind of journey which I went through, which helped to color my own understanding of what kind of Singapore, what kind of Malays do you want to be. You must be wondering now, what has it got to do with heritage? What has that got to do with culture? Are we talking about dance, song and dance only? Yes, of course, I think that's part of our heritage. But I think more important than that is our mind share, our minds, our ideas, our intellectual pursuits. What do we want to do? How do we contribute to the total development of Singapore? Yes, we want to preserve our identity, our Malay Heritage Center, our Malay culture, but what is our understanding of that Malay culture, of Malay heritage? What are the important parts that we want to protect and promote so that we can remain this multicultural, multi-religious Singapore as part of that society? Sorry, thanks. So, I touched just now about the Permiat and how, in fact, we look at Muslim communities, the mindset, and how we have differences, even within our region, and how we overcome them. I was also doing, when I was in campus, Suara Mahasiswa, again, touching on areas about mindset, mindshare again. And I work with people like Cikgu Rahman Samion, radio, and then Seni Asli. Seni Asli, mind you, at that time, I was very surprised myself that Mokram Kasim, he's still alive, and he started this program because he thought that radio and TV Singapore was too centered on documentary and the serious stuff, and there wasn't enough of culture. And so we started this Seni Asli, series of 13 programs, and we would delve into different aspects of Malay culture. I'm very proud that we did that program, Seni Asli. Then, again, for the sake of interest of the community, whether it's Yayasan Rakyat, like people like Cikgu Arif Muhammad, Cikgu Muhammad Simin, and also Shirley Gordon. Shirley Gordon later married Zakaria Bagarib, which is one of the leaders here. But in fact, it's through her that we got funds from a Catholic foundation in Rome called Miserio, and they sent me with a few others to Philippines, because the Catholics are very strong in Philippines. They had the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement. So we went there. I stayed there for 1 month. You'll never guess. To learn to grow mushrooms. Why mushrooms? And at that time, Singapore was actually urbanizing. Singapore doesn't have that kind of land. But the idea of us getting that funds to go and study to grow mushroom was basically to come back and teach the Malays to learn to be self-reliant. Have a skill. We even did our research. At that time, I remember we were importing something like $3 million worth of mushrooms. So we thought there was one area. So we went there, came back, and I remember while on the plane from Manila to Singapore, Straits Times, page 1 lead, Singapore government had acquired the land which we wanted to use for the pilot project in Tanah Merah. And that land was promised by David Marshall, the chief minister. He was very close to the Malay community then. So we lost that land for that pilot project because we wanted to teach enough Malays so that they can go, even when they live in housing board flats, HDB, they can still grow mushroom in the flat. So you can imagine the kind of studies, the kind of consideration we went to. Self-reliance. And we were not really very concerned then about the culture, the heritage, because we feel that survival is about education, about skills, which we have to actually compete with. So Then, of course, there were other things like, where the LBKM, we set up LBKM, because after the riots of 1964, there were no more processions, so we thought the best way to commemorate proper procession, is to have the Scholarship Fund Board, and that's Lembaga Biasa Kenangan Maulud, and then, of course, Jamia Youth, and People's Association activities too, which I was involved in. Again, this helps to color the kind of approach that we want for Singapore, a total approach, an integrated approach. And then I think Dr. Nosharial has mentioned to you about my days at Berita Harian, Berita Minggu, to MUIS, Mendaki, and Malay Heritage Foundation. I think, if I may add, MUIS, Mendaki, again, when I was asked to, because I was already editor of Berita Harian, and I think there was a big issue about trust. Do the Malays have enough trust of the government or the PAP? Does the PAP have enough trust of the Malays? Especially after we left Malaysia. We were a minority in Singapore by itself. When we joined Malaysia, the Malays became a majority. Can you imagine the effect on the Malay mind? The hope that came with that. But when we were forced to leave Malaysia, we were reduced to a minority again, with its ramifications and implications. And that's why there were some Malays who felt that Tunku Abdul Rahman betrayed us when he was more concerned about the race consideration in Malaysia context, but he forgot that about the Singapore Malays. They were reduced to a Malay minority again. But of course, then there were offers for Malays, from Singaporeans to go to Johor, but not many accepted it. Some went over because they were quite generous offers. But then we knew that we had to actually live with a new reality about modern and independent Singapore. MUIS and Mendaki, in fact, again, maybe because I was already at Berita Harian, I have a better understanding. Not only Berita Harian, I'm glad Syaril mentioned Sunday Times, associate editor of the Straits Times, where I was in charge of the ASEAN desk, and I set up the ASEAN desk at Straits Times, and I went to Indonesia and the region to understand the region better. Again, that helped towards the better understanding. And I think the government then slowly began to have more trust in me. Because I was also offered to be a candidate in 1976. But I knew then that the Malay community did not, well, I won't say the whole, but I think half maybe, or 40-60 maybe, did not trust the PAP then because of what has happened. And I, in fact, told them, thank you. I believe in the Singapore, the new Singapore, the modern, independent Singapore, and what we want to achieve. But if I were to accept your offer and be a candidate, I will be seen as a betrayer, a sellout, a traitor, and an opportunist. I would rather work for those objectives, but through the Malay community, and build that trust with them, and maybe later we can decide. So that's how I ended up going to MUIS, going to Mendaki, and that really helped me to understand our community better and forge that trust. But it wasn't easy to get successes. I remember when I brought Yatiman in to, I told them I'll give Berita Harian 5 years, and I give you 5 years for Berita Harian. After that, I have to move on. Thinking of the English journalism. And so I brought in Yatiman. I can still remember one of my friends in ISD said, don't play with fire. I think we know Yatiman then. He was a firebrand. He was very critical of what's happening then. But I knew Yatiman, and I knew he'd be excellent for that job. I said, I have faith in him. I will guide him. I will work with him. Then when I think Dr. Yaakob was kind to actually work with me, and then later on pointed me for MUIS president. And when we wanted to think about succession, because I also felt that as an editor of Berita Harian, I cannot be with CEO of Mendaki or president of MUIS, because as a journalist, as an editor, there are conflict of interest. So then we wanted succession. So I brought in Ma'ruf. Again, people are saying, are you sure? Because Ma'ruf is also a very critical-minded person. They're not sure about these people. And then Mendaki, but fortunately I was able to take on Mendaki. And then Mendaki is a different story. We were able to get civil servants to be seconded to them. Then Malay Heritage Foundation. When, in those days, Malay Heritage, Istana Kampung Glam was still habited by the descendants of the royal family. And so can you imagine? In fact, honestly speaking, I was ashamed to call it our heritage, the Istana Kampung Glam then. We knew it is part of our, important part of our heritage, Kampung Glam, Istana Kampung Glam, and but looking at the shambles it was in, because the descendants just, they were overcrowded, they had even squatters, you know, in addition to the Istana building, they had squatters by the side. And I was even ashamed to tell my friends or tourists, this is our Istana Kampung Glam, our heritage. But because of the element of trust I mentioned earlier on, and when the government decided that they wanted to acquire this place and to make it part of national monument, national heritage, I said, yeah, it's a good idea, but do you have any plans? Because knowing Singapore government then, they're very business-minded, money-minded even. What are you going to take this Istana for? It's valuable ground. You're not going to convert this into a condo, are you? So I thought that if it's not properly handled, again, the Malay community will bring about this question of trust. Can we trust the government to do what we want with this Istana Kampung Glam as a heritage? So again, they asked me to be chairman. I said, no, please, I can't. But thank God, Alhamdulillah, I had my guru, Pak Ridwan Dafir. In fact, Pak Ridwan Dafir was my savior in many ways, whether it's Muiz, whether it's Mendaki. So he was able to come in first. And I had to persuade him, you know, to be chairman. And I remember Pak Ridwan telling me, hey, please, I have retired twice already, you know. I've done all I need to do. He was the top civil servant, director of trade. He was our ambassador, you know. So he was getting on in age. Say, Pak Wan, please, I think I need your help. And finally he agreed, but he said one condition, that I must be his vice president at Muiz, at Mendaki, deputy CEO, and even here. But I didn't know that he had plans. I thought he would stay for 5 years, but after 1.5 years, 2 years, I think, then he said, enough, I'm going to step down. And I had to take over. It's Malay Heritage. But the important thing is that I knew Part 1 is someone who's very neutral, with the community would trust. He's not seen as a politician, you know. And so that was the role Part 1 played for us, for these various institutions. So Malay Heritage Foundation was formed on that basis. And so they say, okay, you can do it, you want it, you do what you like with it. But I said, where's the money? So they said they'll give you 300,000. 300,000, renovation, maintenance? I said, no way. And I recall that I had to even talk to ministers then to persuade them to say, please, if you want us to take over this, please give more money. And finally, they agreed to make it 10 times the money, the original money they promised. And that's what we have today, a beautiful Istana Kampung Glam and a heritage. So, I want to share with you this. I think you recognize this, right? This is the Berita News. And I'm glad that they have put up Istana Kampung Glam as a feature in our news. I'm very happy to see this because not only Istana Kampung Glam, but also Masjid Sultan. That again reflects to me the kind of core values, not only culture, heritage, but religion. Religion is Istana Kampung Glam, which is core to our Malay Muslim heritage. And this is something which I think we need to always bear in mind. What is the role of Islam? I think, I don't know whether you heard this, I've heard this, there are some of the Chinese friends who say that, we love you as Malays. You are wonderful people, so gentle, so kind. But now, as you become more and more Muslim, I'm beginning to worry. I don't blame them too, because the kind of developments that we have in the Muslim world, some of the extremism. But I said, no, this is Singapore Malays. We are different. So, but they must not forget, and they must understand that Islam is core part of our Malay life, Malay mind, Malay culture, and Malay heritage. So that's why I'm very happy to share with you that Surya News to show Istana Kampung Glam with Mr. Sultan. So I think governments must play a part in ensuring that there is this not only collaboration, but also a better understanding of how we can forge that collaboration, that understanding, and that togetherness. So what holds? And this, I think, is the more important part of the topic. Because beyond my grandfather's stories, if I look at my children, if I look at my grandchildren, I ask myself, do they have the same interests? Do they have the same understanding? Obviously, very different. When I talk to young people, they say, please lah, and we don't talk about race, about religion anymore. We are Singaporean. We are now more Singaporean. We have different ideas, different way forward. I said, fine, because we've been doing so well in the last 20 years, everybody gets benefits in terms of jobs, in terms of education, and making a lot of progress. We are feeling more Singaporean, which is actually a blessing. But the day when actually the economy starts to crunch down and problems with employment, who will suffer first? Who will face the race, color issue? Then again it may dawn. So if we have a better understanding of what we went through, I think they will be better prepared. We're not dictating what they should do, but I think a better understanding will make them better prepared. Because the new millennials, the young, will have different challenges. They are more global, even for our Malays. They're more marketable now. If you look at results of university results now, the number of Malays getting first class. Not in my kind of studies, Malay humanities or social sciences, like Dr. Yaakov's areas of studies, engineering. Not only simple engineering, but electrical engineering, different kinds of high-grade engineering, and we are performing. And we are showing that we are equal, if not even better. So I think we have made a lot of progress, but the progress will be inadequate, will not be complete if we lose our heritage, the sense of culture, the sense of identity. We are Malays, Muslims, as a total part of our integrated Singapore. Just as we want our brothers, Chinese and Indians, to also feel the same, to show the kind of respect, just as we would like to respect them too. And this is something which I think we need to work on with our younger generation, millennials and beyond. And in working with them, people like us who have got the history, who got the experience, are we ourselves equipped with the kind of demands of the future? Digitalization is one. I know Dr. Faisal is game on it. I suffer, I have a problem, even when it's come to digitalization. And when I want to share, if I just share stories, not good enough. They will not be able to respond. So we need to find ways how we can actually engage them through their means, through their understanding, and marry the two understandings together, that there be a complete and a better understanding of what holds in the past and what is to come in the future. So I'm glad there are organizations like Som Syed. I was here, in fact, recently when she performed as part of the cultural activities. I was very happy to see that she was able to draw younger people to come and perform. Credit to her. She's really a legend, an icon. But how many of Some sites are there in Singapore. We need to also make sure that enough young will want to be part of that important heritage and important preservation of identity and culture and heritage. Because when we have foreign visitors, like picture on the left there, that's our friends from Oman, Dr. Said Badar, the foreign minister now, and then also the environment minister. Look at the culture, look at the identity of the Malays being reflected there. So I think it's important that when people come to Singapore, they see we are an important part, an integral part of the Singapore we want to see. And the costumes, the young people, part of it I think is important. In fact, this is a royal family from Brunei. I felt ashamed with the Western attire there, but I didn't know what to expect then. But I think whether it's the coat, whether it's the batik, whether it's the baju, I think they all form the total identity, culture, and heritage of our Malays in Singapore. So I think we have a lot to contribute. We have a lot to do more to understand our young before we can ensure that the young will be able to play the part to not only enrich, strengthen our heritage, our culture, our identity as a part of the total multicultural, multi-religious Singapore. So I think I'll stop there and then maybe take some questions. Yeah? Thank you. If I brought some books to show you, there's room to market the book as well. This is the book I mentioned earlier on, Majula, where Dr. Nur Shariel co-edited with me. Now, this is again, as part of our 50th anniversary celebration, we want to make sure that Singaporeans do not forget Malays. The contributions and the role played by the Malays over the last 50 years in different areas, education, culture, economic development, social development, political development. And then when we celebrated our bicentennial 200 years ago, 200 years, a few years ago, and this is the book Beyond Bicentennial. As I mentioned earlier on in my speech, is beyond a lot of things. We got to really think out of the box, beyond the normally what is understood, and see, we can see history, but with the reality of multiracial, global Singapore. And I'm glad that our young intellectuals, Dr. Nur Shariel, Dr. Azhar, has come up with this book. I was very happy to see this book. Different aspects of identity, culture, and heritage, not only in Singapore, but the whole region. I was very happy when I recently spoke to a group of Indonesian senior civil servants. This is a program conducted by NTU with the National Center for Public Administration. We used to have a program for China mayors, but now we have a program for Indonesian civil servants, senior civil servants, and share experience, learn about what Singapore was about and how we can work together. And I was able to pick one of the articles here when they talk about Nurcholish Majid and his ideas about modernization of Islamic thinking. So Dr. Nur Shariel and Dr. Azhar, and I also had this book by Haji Muhammad Taib, Malaysia, and this was written in 1996 after Mahathir's The New Malay, and he was talking about it. But most of it is about what we discussed, like how Singapore Malays, post-independence, was moving towards the challenges of the future, socio-economic. Not very much in terms of the heritage and culture, but in terms of what matters in terms of driving the people and the society together. So these are some of the books which I would recommend, and we can share further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Zainul. Please maybe take a seat and invite Dr. Nur Shariel to help moderate the question and answer session.
Okay.
So, seperti yang kami katakan tadi, pada mereka yang lebih selesa untuk menggunakan kaedah Slido, sila imbas QR code tersebut. Dan kami juga menyediakan mic kalau ada yang mahu bertanya. Cuma kami minta mungkin angkat tangan jadi kami tahu siapa. Dan apabila setelah diberikan mic tu, berikan nama dan mungkin dari mana. Jadi kita boleh tahulah. So saya berikan semula sesi ini kepada Dr. Syaril.
Thank you, Julina. Thank you, Mr. Zainul bin Rasheed, for the sharing. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it's beyond grandfather stories. Well, he did some aspects talk about his grandfather stories, but I think those are very important stories for us to reflect. I think there's plenty to chew from what he's just shared. But what I really admired about his sharing is that, it really started off with looking about the significance of history. I think that's one of the key takeaways I got from your sharing. I mean, we cannot survive in this world without looking at where we begin. And so history is very important. Whether it's Sanila Utama, I would argue that we should go beyond Sanila Utama, if you want to study more about the region. So please, this is self-promotion. Please come to my Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, to know more about the history of the region. And we do a lot of archaeological stuff as well. So I think that's very important. And since we're in the spirit of promoting and marketing books, the book is available outside at a discount price. Please feel free to help yourself to this edited volume that we did together. It's also part of our series to engage the young people. And we are glad that we managed to get not only Singapore Malays, young Singapore Malays, to articulate their views and vision, respective areas, but we also managed to get youth from the region as well. So I think we should continue with this dialogue.
Just to add, Dr. Yaakob also just come up with another book, right? With Dr. Norin Tan. Thank you, Dr. Yaakob.
So I think that this again emphasizes the point that, the significance of writing, and the fact that you showed books, it shows that you need to read in order to generate thinking, ideas, and writing. We should develop this culture in our community as well. And I think you have shared many aspects, your personal history, your personal journey. But I think what I like about your talk is that every single observation that you made, whether it's in Singapore, in your travels, in the Middle East, or in the US, you're always thinking back and reflecting about the community. And what is the best model? What is the best model? What can we take from this? I think that is the mark of, a thinker, to always find the best ways going forward. So I thought, the example you gave about the prayers, the Friday prayers at NASA, I think is very interesting as well. And the US society itself is very interesting about the different kinds of Muslims and different diverse ideas and so on. So I thought those are very good takeaways for us today. So so this is a session where we take questions from the audience. There's a roving mic. So I thought we have about maybe 45 minutes for questions and answers. And for those of you who are watching at home, or even those here who don't feel comfortable or speaking, please, you can use the Slido, and I will read the questions and ask Mrs. Zainul to address them. So let's take the first question, please.
Tomorrow we're starting to fast, right? Ramadan, so be kind.
Anyone? Maybe okay, Prof Farid, okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Maybe I will just make a comment, a reflection on something you had said earlier on in your talk, Mrs. Zainul. You mentioned about history of Singapore, celebration of the bicentennial, and you pointed out that we look now at Singapore history as going beyond 1819, which is of course very true. But I would suggest that there is still a very problematic way in which we look at 1819. it's still overall a very uncritical, the way it is taught in schools, in the way it appears in the textbooks, even at the university level. It's really to say the least strange and even ridiculous that a colonial founder, not only a colonial founder, but an agent of colonialism, an architect of racism in the region, a slave, well, he was involved in abolishment of slavery, but he was a drug pusher, actually. We would probably be executed if he was alive in Singapore today. Is given that level of adulation. And I'm mentioning this because the Malays above all, more than anybody else, have been critical of this, not only in academia, but also in the arts. So in that sense, and this relates to my point, that Malay heritage is not only for the Malays, but it's for Singapore. So when you just take the example of Raffles, the Malays actually are the soul of Singapore. They are the ones who initiated this critique, and they continue the critique, both in academia as well as the arts. Now, the danger is whether the Malays can actually live up to that challenge of being the soul of Singapore, drawing upon the positive aspects of their tradition. Are they going to be absorbed into the mainstream in terms of this kind of mental captivity, uncritical attitude and approach towards many things, on the one hand? On the other hand, are they going to be drawn into a very exclusivist, religious way of thinking? So how do you look at the future in that sense?
Thanks for it. For a moment, when you started asking the question, I was wondering, was Farid Alatas or Syed Hussein Alatas? Professor Syed Hussein Almarhum was my professor too. Taught me at the Malay Studies Department in Singapore University. And a lot of his beliefs are also imbibed in the students, which he taught. The values, the service to the country and people. So we miss him. And I agree with you. I think in terms of education, a few points you raised, in terms of education, this is something which I think people have been talking about too. But in terms of delivery, in terms of how we bring about that, in terms of school curriculum, in terms of books, textbooks, is something which is still lacking. But maybe it's also because the emphasis on that kind of study is not there as much as we would like. So whereas if we see that, for example, when it comes to skills development, they're very well developed and they think of all kinds of angles. But when you talk about history, the reaction will be quite different. But if we was to talk about history in the context of what I think this whole session is all about today, the reflection, the introspection, and what it means in terms of forging that national identity or togetherness, then I think its value will be enhanced. But we also need people who can do that kind of job. And I'm not sure whether our system is geared for that kind of thing, which I think we should really do something about it, look into it. In terms of the Malays themselves, how do they respond to this between those who are actually pushing for the performing arts, literature, cultural, as against, for example, the drive towards wanting to be seen as equal with the others? When it comes to the others, non-Malays particularly, this will be last on their mind in terms of wanting to show the quality, their capability. It will be measured in terms of different kind of yardsticks. even amongst the Malays. To some extent, it's gone to that way because they feel that we're lagging behind, we're trying to catch up, so we must do more than that. And in fact, not only we must do more in terms of the other areas that matters, but in fact, deliberately trying to downplay the identity part or the cultural part so that we won't be misunderstood, as though we have not changed. No? So I think this is the challenge we have to face, because I think we still need people who can actually emphasize the importance of the identity, the culture and heritage, because we don't want to be just subsumed, as you suggest, in terms of the mainstream, so-called mainstream, and we lose that identity. So, yeah, I agree with you that I think we need to look into those areas and see how best we can do it. But if I may add also, in terms of looking at Singapore, what about the regional and the international context? You know, I'm now non-resident ambassador to Kuwait, and there was a new Indonesian ambassador that has just been appointed to Kuwait. It's a lady, Ibu Lena. So when she was appointed, I'm non-resident, so she's there. So we just communicate on WhatsApp, and you know, and then she said, "Are you the former Minister of State for Foreign Affairs?" I said, "Yeah." "Oh, you have forgotten me. We met in the 70s or early 80s when I visited IAIN, Institute Agama Islam Negeri. Now they are universities. When she was a student activist there from HMI, HMI, you know, Himpunan Mahasiswa Islam. So she said, yeah, in fact, she was a guide. She brought me around Jakarta. I had forgotten that, but she's now risen to be ambassador. And there are not many lady ambassadors. And not only is she ambassador, but she's an activist. And while she was there in Kuwait, she organized a webinar to coincide with the International Women's Year on women as inspiration for development. Yeah, so that's kind of people that, because of the early activities, now even in foreign service, I found the value in that. So whether there is room for us also to be working on how we promote the identity, the culture, the heritage internationally. In fact, I must confess, if without her, I didn't even think of doing that in Kuwait. I was thinking more in terms of diplomacy, international relations, Singapore-Middle East relations, maybe at best Islam, development of Islam in Kuwait, because it's one of the modernizing players there. But in terms of Malay heritage, but she is a very active player in that. So similarly, there may be ways we can work together and project that, you know, in terms of the Malay heritage identity and what we're doing to contribute in terms of our own development, whether in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore separately, or as a group through ASEAN. And the element of harmony, the element of integration and working together is an important feature of that.
Thank you. Let's take the second question. Anyone? We haven't got any question in the slide. Oh, yes, Prof. Yaakob, please.
Yaakob, you promised not to ask. Huh?
I promise to ask you a simple question, Zainul. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I just want to take one particular point that you mentioned and you just answered to Farid. In the issue of heritage and identity, there's always this notion about, do we tap only within the small pool, or we tap into the larger pool of Nusantara? You know, this morning, if you look at the Straits Times, there was this beautiful letter, which I posted on the Facebook, of a guy saying, the causeway has really opened up. And I said, we are more connected than what you imagined to be. And that brings the second point that you raised in much of your earlier discussion about trust. If we as Singaporean Malays tap into the larger pool of Nusantara to inform our identity and our understanding of what Malay heritage is all about, do you think we're treading on something a bit more dicey in terms of how people will see us? In fact, or is it our right? Because we are part of Nusantara. Huh? Even though there'll be a new capital in Jakarta called Nusantara, we'll be part of Nusantara. So how would you tell a younger Malay that, you know, you must see yourself as part of Southeast Asia, not just part of Singapore, and that in being part of Southeast Asia, you are in no way do you sort of undermine your position as a Singaporean, basically. So in a way, tapping to that larger pool helps you to inform your identity, and in some way strengthen your identity also as a Singaporean. Your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you, Eko. I think that's a very interesting point and it's a very tricky area because it also depends on how we Malays in Singapore look at the Malays in our neighbors, Malaysian Malays, Indonesians. How do we look at them? Do we see them as a source of strength or something which we try to avoid, say, hey, better not be associated with them? Because these are real questions. Because with the kind of problems or challenges they may have individually, Malaysia as a country, Malaysia in terms of race politics, Malaysia in terms, Indonesia in its own, whether it's Jokowi or pre-Jokowi and what happens after that. And Indonesia is such a sprawling archipelago with different kind of challenges, whether the Javanese as compared to the Sumatrans and the Sulawesi. You know, at the talk I gave at the civil service group, I recall that I was given a one-to-one interview by Habibie, and he was the only non-Javanese president of Indonesia. But that also because emergency, he was a vice president, so he took over for a while. But after that, when it comes to election, will a non-Javanese ever be elected as president of Indonesia? So these are some of the things we can accuse non-Malays of being racist, but even among ourselves, between the Javanese and the Bayanese and the Malays, there are also issues. So when you look at the global picture, whether those would be the negative points that may make even our people say, hey, better not be seen as one Nusantara. But on the other hand, I feel there are a lot of strong points where, in fact, the Nusantara element can come out, and Singapore can be seen as part of that. And when we say that Singapore being part of that, how do you interpret that again? You know, the Malays or the Singaporean as a whole? Because even Singapore wants to be seen as part of the regional ASEAN, for example. There are issues sometimes when we have with individual countries, we turn to the general ASEAN cooperation to try and minimize the bilateral differences. These are real problems and real challenges. So I think you have a point there that I think is not easy, but I personally believe, in fact, there are areas we can actually work on, and we use the project that, I mean, depending again how things will develop in Malaysia, how things will develop in Indonesia particularly. In Southern Thailand is something else, Patani. Philippines, what do you call them? Mindanao. They have their own challenges, their own problems. Minorities. But if you just take the closer group of Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and perhaps Brunei, but Brunei is also unique in itself. And I don't know whether Brunei also want to be lumped together as a Nusantara. Yeah? So there are issues, there are challenges, but there are areas which we can actually tap upon, like the example I mentioned about Ambassador Lina in Kuwait. So she is active, she is aggressive, and she's using that even not only to promote the Nusantara aspect about culture, but also about the gender issues. And coming from Indonesia, talk about gender, you know, in terms of International Women Year, I think that will help in terms of uplifting the image of they are not that backward, they are also progressive.
I think I have a related question to what the Prof said. It's more about the region. I think it's also based on your earlier point, you talk about PERMIAT and why it failed. PERMIAT and that student PERMIAT and how it failed. In fact, your generation is the most interesting generation. If I want to do a second PhD, I would have done a topic on Muslim resurgence in Singapore. Because we have Mr. Zainul here, one of the earliest graduates. We have Prof. Yaakob, J. Idris, Dr. Aisha, they're all here. They need to be interviewed. We need to document this movement and the implications. But on a related point, no PERMIAT failed because I think you alluded to it earlier that they went on different directions, right? And you mentioned Nurul Khalis, interesting, as an interesting topic that you raised in the book. But looking at the developments today, Islamization, growing piety in the region, you know, which direction do you think we should be heading to? Is it the Indonesian way, or the Malaysian way, or as you mentioned earlier, you know, we talk about the model, you know, but what are the ingredients to this model? What are your thoughts?
I think that question should be answered by the moderator, right? He's the expert. In fact, recently he commented also about this question of Nusantara. And people are saying that, in fact, Singapore Muslims don't have enough reference about the Nusantara Muslim thinking, what's happening in Indonesia, I think particularly Indonesia, less so Malaysia. But talking about Malaysia, when I went around the world to look at models of Muslim, in fact, I was driven by my wish that Malaysia would be that model. I would see Indonesia differently because Indonesia is, what, 95% Muslims? To me, that's not the measure. I want to see a real multiracial, multi-religious society, community, country that can show itself that it can be a successful government, country, with the integrity, with non-corruption and all that. And in fact, I had seen Malaysia as that model. Maybe because I was influenced by Anwar, the Anwar I knew. And the conferences we attended in America, in Libya, and in the region. And I felt that Indonesia was more complicated then because it was Suharto era and the strong military power, so they would go a different way. And it's so much more complicated, much more complex as a country. I mentioned about Javanese, Balinese, and the cultural, the traditional drives and all that. But Malaysia, I thought, being multiracial, although the Muslims are in control and they are more open-minded, and they will be able to develop that model, a truly multi-religious, multiracial model of what the world needed, so that the rest of the non-Muslim world can see, in fact, Islam can work, even though you have quite substantial Muslim and non-Muslims as a minority. But I must say that, I wonder now what is the direction Malaysia will take in terms of that. Because when Mahathir took over, Mahathir was very driven, also more socialist in orientation, but then he brought in Anwar Ibrahim to balance the two and with greater acceptance. But going forward, maybe our Datuk can answer that. But I was very hopeful. I wanted to see a model where it is really multiracial, multi-religious, but with a Muslim majority in charge, running a government successfully with all the integrity and the non-corrupt issues. I want to see that. In Singapore, we are a minority, too small a minority to be that kind of difference in terms of deciding what Singapore will be, but we are an important player. So, I don't know, I suppose, but we had our problems even, in the case of Permiat, so we had to decide to disband it, and then go on our own way, looking at our own priorities, our own models, and develop our own in terms of the contextualization again.
Anyone in the audience has a question? Yes, please.
Hello, Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. My name is Nasar. I know you mentioned NASA, but my name is Nasar. I'm from 4PM. Pardon me, I'm a bit nervous talking to such an esteemed panel of guests here. But probably I just want to ask from the point of view, or at least speaking from the point of view of the youth in Singapore, because I'm quite excited for today's topic, because you're talking about the future of Malay heritage. And for the youth who have not had the benefit that Zainul, you were speaking about, the historical realities of World War II, the racial riots and whatnot, their views may be slightly different probably from the current mainstream narrative of what is Malay heritage. To them, probably it is, their TikTok videos or somewhat their own version of music, or something that's of their interest. And are we as a community now and the future are able to accept those alternative realities, those alternative, what they consider as heritage in the future? Probably your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Pak PM again goes back to a long way where we learn our debating skills, or rhetorical and debating skills. And I still remember Pak PM very well at Jalan Yunus. But now you have regenerated young people. In fact, you are very diplomatic, very kind when you say slightly different. In fact, it's very different. I can see it with my own children and with the... But this is people who are close to me. But imagine with non-Malays, the young non-Malays, and the kind of life they lead. And although government has got policies about integration, like HDB, there's a limit to 30% Malays to make sure that there are enough mixing of Malays and non-Malays. But living 70% or 30%, but that does not mean they mix. They could be just smiling at the lift and that's it. But they don't actually interact. So I think there are challenges. So I think what you said, that's one of the challenges I feel that we need to really understand the young. Their mind is one thing, the method, the technology, you mentioned TikTok, but for people like us, I enjoy TikTok too, tapi to go to TikTok, to reach out to you all, I don't think people like us can. But how do we do that? I think Malay Heritage Foundation, I think I must throw it back to Malay Heritage Foundation. People like Azhar and Dr. Noshari, I think we're better understanding about how to reach out to the young. Yeah, and I think some of the programs they have, I think will encourage the young to come because they are also very engaging, very interactive. It's not just a lecture, talk down, but more sembang and discussion and interaction and welcoming different viewpoints. I think that would be good. But I think even then, they may not even say, oh, Malay Heritage Center, enough lah, you know. But how do you reach out to them? Pak PM will have to play an important role because you have the young with you, right? So there are many ways we need to really look into how, whether it's the technology, whether it's the approach, whether it's the understanding, we need to really go all those aspects and try and reach out to them.
Still have no questions on Slido, so I'll take another question for this. Yes, Encik Rahim. But before that, I think NASA is being so humble. He's actually the new president of 4PM. He's the new president of 4PM. Yes.
No, he's taken over.
Many people don't know that.
Yeah. But it's after a long time, right?
Encik Rahim, please.
Yes, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Cik Zainul, apa khabar?
MashaAllah.
Yeah, you mentioned about your life story, about your education. You went to Raffles when you were young, right? So I just heard a story from my friend who has a son in Raffles. He was saying that, you know, in Raffles there's 600 plus students, you know, but only about 25 Malay boys are there, right? 25 Malay boys in Raffles institution. So I'm talking about the numbers, right? Number of Malay students in RI, and compared to the other races. And also from my own personal experience, my daughter just graduated from law school. Very few numbers of Malays, just like when I was in law school. The numbers don't change. So my question is about how far we have developed. When you set up, or the government set up Mendaki, and you set up certain KPIs and parameters of what you intend to achieve, do you think that you have achieved those objectives now? That was 1980-81, that's 40 years ago. So I don't know if it's a difficult question or an easy question, but hope you can comment to us about our education. I'm sure, you know, there are many, you know, happy statistics that we have, but have we reached what we set out to achieve when Mendaki was set up? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, that's an area again of concern to us. If I can go into the example about RI. In fact, when I was on the board of RI, Board of Governors, we were so very concerned about that. And we even introduced special bursaries or scholarships, bursaries actually, to attract more Malays. Because we found out that the numbers were falling. And so we even went down to primary 5 students, identified primary 5 students who are with potential, and we tell them we'll give you bursary so that you do your primary 5, primary 6, and they come to RI. But to our surprise, there were not many takers because they are also becoming, for 2 reasons. One, they feel that they would rather go to a neighborhood school, right? Because they feel that they can excel. They become the top neighborhood school. But they go to RI, they become among the average, or even below average. The second point is that they don't want to accept bursaries because it becomes like a stigma on them. That as though they can only go to RI because somebody is giving charity to them. So we had that problem. So I think whether it's RI, whether it's the university, and what kind of causes, I think this is something, I think generally it has improved. Over the years, clearly it has improved. Numbers have improved, and the quality also is improved. Whether it's enough, that's your question, right? And whether in terms of numbers, whether in terms of interaction, whether the opportunity is provided because they are there. You may have the numbers in NRI more, but how does it bring about the kind of understanding between the Malay students and the Chinese students? Because the Malay students, that is one of the reasons why, in fact, we have a cap in terms of Malays in certain schools. Because the moment we go to 40-50% Malays in one school, they all speak Malay among themselves. So we have a cap even that, so that we force sort of interaction and mixing around. These are some of the issues which we try to do. But physically, numbers, one thing. Interaction, making friends. You ask an average, I want to say Chinese, but maybe you should ask the Malays too. How many of their friends are of the other race? You'll be surprised to see there's very little. There are a lot of Chinese Singaporeans who don't have Malay friends, because the opportunity is not numbers are there in schools there, but they don't mix. Out of convenience, out of interest, they are quite different. So I think those are real issues. And then at the workplace is also another. And then also halal. That's why some of them complain about halalness. Before you all can sit together and eat together, no issue. You may eat your own food, but we sit together. Of course, in those days, minum sikit pun boleh lah. But now, we don't want to eat together because it's not halal. You're eating there, you have non-halal food, I would rather not. I would rather go and eat only a halal food stall. And even the opportunity of mixing and living together is also being reduced. So those are some of the issues on the practical ground. And we talk about them, but whether really something can be done is really not easy, So I think this is where Farid's earlier point, in terms of education in schools, about the history and also about what it means by our multiracial, multireligious Singapore. Is it just a show, or is it the understanding that will determine the kind of Singapore that we want as we go forward? I think that is very critical, because if we don't have that, I think like for example, in university, I deliberately didn't want to just concentrate on the Malay organizations because I want to be seen and contributing to the non-Malay areas, general areas, Singapore areas, external relations, economic society. But then the Malays say, we are already short of people. We need the Malays to concentrate on the Malay organizations. So like Chamber, I'm glad you were president of Chamber before, but what about the other national organizations? How do we get more Malays to be contribute? Will they be confident enough? Will they be accepted enough? International Chamber of Commerce or the others. So this is where the challenge for us. Yeah? And that challenge continues.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for discussion. So just be mindful of time. We have 2 questions. Imran first?
Maybe we should just get all the questions.
Oh, sure. We can do that.
Thank you, Encik Zainul. I really enjoyed your lecture. We often heard the phrase, the identity of Singaporean Malay Muslim, right? But identity is very complex. It evolves, and there's a lot of multiple aspects of the identity. So we can't speak of a single identity. But within the Malay Muslim community, there are multiple contestations over the issue of identities. You mentioned the earlier involvement of Permiat, which is very fascinating, and how the early younger, I mean, some of them are here, Cik Idris, Prof. Yaakob, and all that. In their younger days, they were engaging with multiple strands of thinking and orientations. And you look at some of their writings when they were young, in Insaf, is it? Or Sedah? I forgot. Insaf, right? I've seen your writing also in there. And they were engaging with diverse thinkers and orientations that are contesting with each other all over the Muslim world. But somehow, along the way, from the 1980s to 1990s, something has changed, that we are obsessed with a single narrative, a single identity, and we forgot how to engage with the multiplicity of identities in our community. And when you have that lack of engagements, then you find that some groups felt that they don't have a part to play in forging that overall narrative of what it means to be Malay Muslim here in Singapore. And it creates a lot of tensions now. So I think we have to go back to the very basis of how we accept the multiple and contesting identities within our community, and also how do we think about ways of engagement that will actually be looking towards a new future that engages with the reality that we have on the ground. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Maybe get another question, the gentleman. Yeah. Forgot your name. I think it's Idham, is it? Idham, yes.
Yeah, Idham, the big fat one. Assalamualaikum, I'm Idham. Adding on to my former colleague's point, Imran, I would like to also know, last time, this place brings me back memories. We actually organized, I think some years ago, discussing about the identity, the status quo, the Malays in Singapore back then, dengan arwah Cikgu Naim Daipi, Mr. Alim Kadir. We had a symposium here attended by almost 200 people. Until now, I still do not know what is the identity of Malay Singapore Malays. Until today, I'm still confused. Anyway, but adding on to my friend's point is that I'd like to know, how can we know the identity? And I was actually moved by a thesis written by Professor Vincent Tan from SMU with regards to the social mobility of the Singapore Malays itself. As like what Cik Zainul mentioned just now, not many Chinese know how many Malays. I think that is the problem. Knowing, I come from ACS, so I relate to RI students' problem, but we do it better. We give free places to Malays who wants to come to ACSI, paid by the alumni. The point is that a lot of my friends are saying they cannot identify capable Malays to fill in posts. We always hear Malays saying, tak ada peluang, tak ada peluang. But most of my friends who are headhunters are saying, there are Malays who are able to do this, there are Malays who are qualified to do this, can you please introduce me? Based on that, I'm right now setting up a foundation called Cheetah Foundation to actually improve social engagement with the other races for the Malays so that they can understand why and our way of life, our way of doing things. Like tomorrow is Ramadan, so a lot of the Chinese bosses, I also work with PMATs, you see. So a lot of the bosses are telling me a lot of Malays want to go back early during Ramadan. They are weak. 5:30 must go home, cook for the family. Cannot overtime because malam ada tarawih. Then we have to pray 5 times a day. And these are the questions which actually surfaced during, I think, a study done by an organization here. So how does our identity, heritage, we need to tell them the real story of, the real picture of who we are. You know, Ramadan doesn't mean that saya lembek. Serious. You know, prayer doesn't take half an hour. Going to Friday prayer doesn't take 2 hours. You know, allowing workers to go. I think a lot of efforts need to be put in to actually clarify, highlight, and demystify what Malay Muslims' identity is. Thank you.
I think there are serious issues there about the understanding or lack of understanding. Equally important, I think there are also problems of not wanting to understand. If there are enough people who want to understand and reach out, I think we can do something. But there are some people who feel, no need to talk about it. We just carry on with our own lives, and then we are Singaporean. There's no issue about race, about language, or religion. So whether there is that need especially from the non-Malays wanting to understand Malays and Muslims, because even the issue of being Malay and being Muslim, we see it as integrated as one, but they see it as a problem. What kind of Muslims you're going to be? So I think here again, how do we bring about the better understanding is something which I think we need to. I think your example of Cheetah, your new organization, started off with the more professionals. This is a new development, whereas we have been concentrating on Mendaki, education, MUIS, religious development. But even MUIS, I think initially was basically mosque development, rather than what we're talking about in terms of identity. All this came much later. And maybe it's easier for a more professional organization, which I think the non-Muslim can relate easier to, in terms of bringing about that better understanding than them having to go to MUIS. Because when you talk about MUIS, religious council, religious organization, they already had that concern, rather than working in the secular context. So I think a question of approach is one, whether it's Mendaki has done his job and done the job well. But going forward, Mendaki, AMP, they feel that need at one time. But now, when we talk about all these issues, these challenges, which organization is actually handling it? I don't think there is any. And then if you want to have organization handling these kind of developments, who do we work with? When you talk about the ministry curriculum, is it the ministry, the thinkers, the policy makers? When you talk about the Chinese community, is it the Chinese chamber? Or is it younger? Is there a Chinese version of AMP? There isn't, I'm sure. So where do we reach out to? So if you just depend on students, leaving to them the interaction, it won't happen. They're just going to have Rojak and Mirabos together, maybe. But talking about Rojak Mirabos, I'm glad Zainul Rahman is here. So it's going to develop something also along those lines about the importance of food. I think there's also a book recently out on food. Food is a very important, maybe important way of us getting and reaching out first through food and then bringing about the understanding. But I think these are the issues I think we need to handle. And when we talk about heritage, for example, even this Malay Heritage Center, how many non-Muslims and non-Malays do we get actively coming to this visit? And what do we show them? I think the exhibition which you have, I think is a very attractive idea, very good ideas there to show. But are we attracting the Chinese, enough Chinese and enough non-Malays? I think that's a challenge for us, right? So we need to identify and then try and get them to work with us so that we can have better interaction. But mind you, it's not just about them understanding us. It's also about us understanding them. That also can be a challenge. So I think Imran's question, I think yeah, again, it revolves around those areas too, Better understanding what the challenges are, who are the agents of change, who are the agents that can do the reach out for us, and whether it's the intellectual university level, Cendekiawan level, or is it the PA, People Association, the grassroots organizations. Because we see at the grassroots organization, they're basically, activities which we do get participation. But understanding these kind of ideas, this kind of concern, these kind of issues, I think hardly happen. So it's a different level altogether. So the challenges are there. I'm glad we have this topic. But I'm glad also that this topic is not just about the dance, song and dance, but it's also about the mindset, and how we can actually work with all parties concerned, non-Muslims, non-Malays, the region, policymakers, And before that, ourselves, asking the questions which we are asking now. What is it that we want to put across? How much of the heritage is actually about our concerns about losing the traditional ideas of heritage, which I think may be of less importance to the non-Malays, non-Muslims. But when it comes to your mindset, mind share about what kind of Muslim you're going to be, what kind of Malays you're going to be, or what kind of Malay Muslim you're going to be in the context of the Singapore we have today, in the context of relationship with our neighbors, ASEAN, and the world. I think that is something we need to address, and we'll have to leave it to the younger people to work on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainul. I think it's a very fascinating talk, very fascinating engagement. I just wanted to highlight the earlier point you mentioned about, most of the questions you talk about multiplicity, diversity, but I think an earlier point you mentioned in your speech about how the founding leaders actually mediate this. I think diversity is a given in a society. There are different ethnic groups, right? And how certain communities have to make sacrifice in order for the greater good. I think those were mentioned earlier in your speech, Of course, certain communities were upset about certain things, but at the end of the day, they were willing to make that sacrifice for the greater good. But at times when we talk about diversity and multiplicity, we tend to focus more on inter-ethnic. It's always about the different ethnic communities. Sometimes we forget within the community itself there are diversities. There are cross-ethnic problems, cross-ethnic issues. And here I'm talking about class issues, for instance. Within the Muslim community, there is a diversity of orientations, for instance, and we've not really openly discussed this. Maybe we should invite you again for a siri ketiga Cendekiawan series yang pertama, and Mr. Zainul, we can discuss these issues. But it's really a fascinating talk. I think it's a good engagement. I think you have brought us the significance of history and always reflecting about the community and the problems. And I think this should go on. And I think this is a conversation starter. The Cendekiawan series is a conversation starter. As I mentioned in my speech, is to mungkin mengusik minda masyarakat, to get them thinking. I think that's important. I mean, if we keep on talking about success stories without talking about problems, I don't think we are seriously engaging with the real issues of the day. So I think that's all the time we have. We should conclude because I think it's also very close to Ramadan. I think we want to make Selamat berpuasa to everyone. Thank you for our community leaders who are here today. Minister of State, Dr. Faisal Ibrahim, thank you for making time. High Commissioner to Malaysia, Dato' Asfar, thank you for joining us, Prof. Yaakob Ibrahim, and all of you here who joined us today. Selamat berpuasa, thank you very much. So before we go, maybe I would like to take this opportunity to present a token of appreciation to our Cendekiawan series lecturer. More books for him to read and more talks, inshallah, in future. Thank you. Let's put our hands together to thank the Zainul Abidin.
This collection is quite special because it's about the center itself. And as some of you know, we are going for a revamp towards the end of the year. So terima kasih Cik Zainul atas perkongsian tadi. Sudah seperti yang dikatakan, definitely more than grandfather stories. Okay. Banyak kata-kata mutiara yang boleh kita menjadikan pemangkin dan juga inspirasi untuk kita semua. So saya persilakan Cik Zainul dan Dr. Nur Syaril untuk kembali ke tempat duduk. Okay. Right. Actually, I wanted to respond something, if I may. Chairman, can I just make a quick response? For what Dr. Cik Zainul mentioned about this interaction between how we can also generate interaction with others. And I wanted to present another perspective, which is a flip side. Apart from being a general manager with Foundation, I'm also a volunteer docent, meaning I do guide, tell the stories about the community at the museum and also outside here at Kampung Gelam. So we want to tell the stories about the community, the heritage, what it all means. Now the interesting thing is we have about almost 70 guides, very active volunteers who volunteer at the Malay Heritage Centre, and I tell you, less than 10 are Malay speaking. Okay? The remaining are people from Japan, from Korea, from Europe, from America. They are very interested to know about us. But why is it we are not coming forward to share our own stories? So this is another perspective to your whole issue about, how do we, what can we do to really promote our identity, the multiplicity, the diversity, the richness that we have, when we ourselves sometimes are not the ones coming forward. So when we do have visitors, sometimes from Malaysia, from Brunei, and the guide that's bringing them through to the exhibitions, for example, is someone from Europe. But interestingly, they sometimes bring very interesting anecdotes. So one of the docents, for example, pointed out this particular design of a porcelain, which came from UK, and apparently it's only made in this particular factory in UK, specifically for the Asian market, because of the whole China trade, because of the whole porcelain trade that goes through from Singapore. So I think there's always room for us to learn from each other, but it's also about, at the end of the day, both parties have to play a part. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So with that, I just wanted to share that. Okay. So, So, terima kasih Cik Zainul dan Dr. Nisharil, dan untuk membantu kami terus mempertingkatkan program-program yang kami lakukan, sila imbas QR code ni dan mungkin bantu kami untuk memberikan maklum balas. Okay. Right. So the next one. Seperti yang dikatakan awal tadi, kami masih memerlukan sokongan anda untuk menjayakan pelbagai program kami. Secara ringkas, MHF merancang untuk menganjurkan 18 sesi ceramah, webinar dan seminar secara total sepanjang tahun. Ini termasuk siri webinar yang akan berlangsung dalam talian dan sesi seminar khusus untuk golongan belia. Ini adalah antara usaha kami untuk merancangkan budaya mengkaji dan pendokumentasian untuk memperkasa warisan intelektual dan gedung ilmu masyarakat kita. Kami juga ada menerbitkan beberapa buku, jika ada yang berminat boleh mendapatkannya di luar dewan nanti. Selain penerbitan buku, MHF juga ada menganjurkan acara kemuncak Hari Warisan untuk meraihkan dan memperingati sumbangan golongan budayaan kita menjelang akhir tahun ini. Jadi, so untuk mengetahui tentang kegiatan kami, boleh mengikuti kami dalam kesemua social media channel ini. The next one? The next one? Yes. That's the most important question. That's the most important one. Okay. So, kami ada kod QR. Ada tak? Okay, tak apa. Right, yes, finally. Okay, so anda boleh juga mengimbas kod QR ini untuk memberikan sumbangan anda. Setiap sumbangan $50 ke atas akan diberikan pelepasan cukai 2.5%. Okay, kita sudah pun sampai di penghujung majlis. Kami ada menyediakan sikit buah tangan untuk semua. Bawa baliklah Masa besok dah berpuasa kan. Jadi jangan lupa untuk mengambilnya apabila keluar dari dewan nanti. Jadi sebelum mengundur diri, kami sekali lagi mengucapkan ribuan terima kasih atas kehadiran anda pada hari ini. Selamat menjalani ibadah puasa sehingga bertemu lagi di lain kesempatan. Saya Julina mengundur diri. Oh, ada nak coba cik? Oh, tadi ada orang main macam TikTok kan? So Cik Zainul pun.
Sorry bang jago, ampun bang jago. Ampun bang jago.
Yes, okay. So terima kasih dan hingga bertemu lagi.